Hello, everyone. If you could take your seats, we'll get started on the lunch program. You might have noticed on the printed programs that Captain John Reeves was going to give the welcome and introduction of our keynote speaker today. He unfortunately is not able to make it. He sends his sincere regrets. So I am going to introduce Captain Greg Stanclik, who is the second in command on the HEALY cutter here in Seattle. Captain Greg Stanclik has 27 years of service in the U.S. Coast Guard, including over 11 years of sea duty. He has been to the Antarctic continent and McMurdo Station for Operation Deep Freeze 2003. Captain Stanclik has been on 5 missions to the Arctic, including an east-to-west transit of the Northwest Passage, and has circumnavigated North America. He is currently the executive officer or second in command of the United States Coast Guard cutter HEALY, homeported here in Seattle. Please welcome Commander Stanclik.
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for attending this wonderful symposium. Thank you, Rachel, for organizing it for a second year. This is outstanding. Welcome all distinguished guests from around the world who are interested and vested in the fate of the Arctic. I am Captain Gregory Stanclik, the Executive Officer of the United States Coast Guard cutter HEALY, our nation's premier high-latitude science and research platform. It is my distinct honor to have the opportunity to introduce our final keynote speaker for today. Vice Admiral Charles Ray has been the commander of the U.S. Coast Guard Pacific Area since April of 2014. With a workforce of 13,000 active duty, reserve, auxiliary, and civilian personnel, the Pacific Area conducts daily operations in support of a full range of Coast Guard missions, from search and rescue to law enforcement to maritime domain awareness and protecting the environment. Most germane to this symposium, Vice Admiral Ray is responsible for ensuring the Coast Guard's responsibility in the Arctic are conducted properly and efficiently. The Coast Guard's 17th District, led by Rear Admiral Abel in Juneau, is responsible not only for the better-known Coast Guard missions, such as search and rescue, port state control, and living marine resource protection, but also Arctic science support and recently Operation Arctic Shield. Arctic Shield is the annual exercise of focused operations in the Arctic. This past summer's priorities were increased seasonal presence, advancing regional awareness and partnerships, improving preparedness and response capabilities, and testing new capabilities and refining requirements. All of this is in support of the Coast Guard's Arctic strategy objectives of improving awareness, broadening partnerships, and modernizing governance, which in turn supports our national strategy for the Arctic region. Previous to this assignment, Vice Admiral Ray served in several key flag positions, including Deputy Pacific Area Commander, Commander of the 14th Coast Guard District in Hawaii, Director of the Iraq Training and Advisory Missions to the Ministry of Interior, U.S. Forces Iraq, and the Military Advisor to the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. Vice Admiral Ray's career started with the graduation from the Coast Guard Academy in 1981 and subsequent assignments as a deck watch officer to the Coast Guard cutter Acushnet, which at the time was homeported in Ketchikan, Alaska. He quickly earned his wings in 1983 and served as a distinguished career as a rotary wing aviator and aeronautical engineer at 6 air stations from Alaska to the Caribbean, including the command of Air Station Puerto Rico, amassing over 5,000 hours of flight time. He has multiple master's degrees and numerous personal decorations. Without further ado, it is my sincere pleasure to welcome Vice Admiral Ray, Pacific Area Commander.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? It's great to be here. Please keep eating. My family makes it a point to start eating when I start talking. So You are not going to hurt my feelings in any way, shape, or form. It's really great to be here and to be part of this symposium. I'm sorry I missed it yesterday. Before I get started, I want to thank Senator Michalski for being here. Thank you for your support of our service, ma'am, and all that you do for our service and for the citizens of Alaska and for our nation. We appreciate it. And to all the other distinguished guests, both elected officials and appointed, and to the folks that have traveled from the far north to be here and share with us your perspective, I thank you for that. And I'm sorry I missed yesterday. My goal is really quite simple. This is the Super Bowl of Arctic advocacy, I'm sure, and since we're in the Super Bowl season. And my goal here is just really kind of lay out the way the Coast Guard sees this. Admiral Abel did a great job of talking about the 17th Coast Guard District and the challenges he has and what he's up against and the general intent. And I'll kind of broaden it out a little bit and talk about the Coast Guard writ large and how we look at this. And then at the end, we'll have some questions. It's pretty straightforward. My goal is that at the end of, when I get through speaking, that you understand that we understand as your Coast Guard that we have responsibilities in the Arctic. And our responsibilities are not shrinking, they're growing. And we understand that and we take them seriously. The second thing is I want you to have the confidence that we have a plan. We have a strategic plan, which has been alluded to several times, and we have down to the water level practical application of that strategy that we are working on every year to get better at this. And then I want you to know that we understand there are gaps, and we're working on these gaps. We've got challenges. There's technology that we don't have yet to meet the challenges of the Arctic. It's different up there, as we'll talk about. And then I want you to know that there are gaps as a nation that we have that would enable the Coast Guard. And we just want to illustrate the nation has to decide how much Coast Guard they need to work in the Arctic. And so hopefully at the end of my little discussion here, we'll have that. So without much further ado, everybody's got their chart of the Arctic. Everybody's got their favorite one. This is Jermaine does. We've been talking about the Arctic for a decade, really seriously now in the Coast Guard. And it's all because of this. The pink line indicates where for decades, at least since people have been looking at this closely and measuring it, that was the extent of the sea ice in September. The white is where it was in September of 12. So quite frankly, there's more water where there used to be ice, and where there's more water, the Coast Guard needs to be there. The citizens and the people who serve, live, and work here, earn their living, they have every just as much right to Coast Guard as someone in Southern California. And so we need to prepare for that and work towards that, and that's what we've been about. And that's why I'm here today, and that's why Admiral Abel has talked like he did earlier. And as Admiral Abel also mentioned, and I'll elaborate a little bit, history is important. This is not our first rodeo when it comes to the Arctic. As was stated, the Coast Guard cutter Rush was on scene in Sitka when the Russian flag was hauled down. And it was actually the revenue cutter at the time, but you get the picture. And the American flag was hauled up. This is the famous cutter Bear, the one that Admiral Abel referred to of hell-roaring Mike HEALY, who is really significant, by the way, first African-American in the history of our nation to command anything. And he commanded the revenue cutter Bear, son of a slave. And we could talk about that all day, but that's another proud part of our history. Anyway, the Bear, as Admiral Abel said, brought the law to the Arctic and to Alaska. And she served after he left. In fact, she served all the way up to World War I. The cool thing about the Bear is, if you ever want to read a really great story that kind of puts into perspective the challenge of the Arctic, read about the Jarvis expedition of 1897. 1897, and it's all about what we're about now. That was 100 years ago, but it's about innovation, it's about persistence, and those guys came around from Seattle due to some whalers, which wasn't unusual at the time, 265 whalers stuck in the ice off a barrel, and they did this incredible overland expedition where they actually met with native folks. One of the revenue cutter guys spoke the language, and they met with native folks and drove reindeer up there and rescued the whalers. It took a year to do the mission. It's an incredible rescue story. But the point is, we've been doing this. We've been operating here, and we intend to continue that. The second, and this is an iconic picture, and so I didn't know of a better way to get it other than this painting. This is the Coast Guard cutter Storis, Bramble, and Spar, the first U.S. vessels to circumnavigate the North American continent. They left and transited the Northwest Passage in 1957. And another thing that's kind of cool and kind of germane today is Storrs was on duty until what? 5 years ago, Dan? When did she hang up? Yeah. So this same ship that was old when she circumnavigated the North American continent, she just was taken out of service about 5 years ago. My point there, hopefully not too subtle, is that an investment in the Coast Guard is a pretty good investment. It's a long-term investment. And yet, we're still doing it. This is the Coast Guard cutter Stratton. This is from last summer. She's up off of Barrow. She served up there, and as Admiral Abel mentioned, we understand that you cannot, what you did in the past is in the past. What we've got to do is learn how to operate in the future and operate in how it is now. And so we've taken our newest national security cutters because they have incredibly capable command and control capabilities. They have abilities to great range, great endurance. And so we put them up here to kind of learn how to operate and learn how to use them in these particular waters. And quite frankly, there's not a lot of business here for them right now, but we're about preparing for the future and learn how we will operate up here. And so these cutters, the three that are home ported in Alameda, have all spent time up here, and that's a real asset to our service. And really, there's a lot of policy groups, and there's a lot of papers being written and commissions, but I'm going to tell you, there is no substitute for just being there. There's no substitute. You got to come up here and operate. As any of the elders will tell you, it's different in the Arctic. It's different in Alaska, quite frankly. I remember, so this is a rescue swimmer. This is a few years ago when we first started coming back up to the Arctic. This is a crew from Air Station Kodiak, Alaska, and they don't teach that maneuver that rescue swimmers do in a rescue swimmer school down in North Carolina. They kind of had to make that up here. And it reminded me of a time about almost 30 years ago when we first started doing rescue swimmers when I was in Kodiak, and I was a helicopter pilot. And so we were doing these procedures, and I was out there getting checked out. And I saw the rescue swimmer in the water. Now, we were in Chiniak Bay there, and the rescue swimmer starts giving this signal. And I said, what is that signal he's giving? I don't quite understand. They said, that's the emergency pickup signal. That means there's danger there. I said, really? This is not practical? No, this is the real. So we go and we snatch him up, and he said, you didn't see those orcas out there? So my point is it's different in the Arctic. Now, Kodiak is a day at the beach compared to the Arctic, but at any rate, we have to work. And so that's what we've been doing on a seasonal basis, which is when primarily the operations are. We've been coming up here, and in the past 5 years, we've been doing it in earnest. One of the things that we take a lot of pride in, if you kind of look at the pictures around this, is when we come to the Arctic, we do just as was mentioned today. We spend a lot of time listening. We try to advertise that we're coming because we don't want to be this mysterious federal presence out in the ocean offshore that people hear that's there. We want to come and let people know we're there. And we want them to know why we're there and what we're doing. And so if you look at the pictures on this slide, you'll see that we've advertised we're coming. We met with elders there, and we listened. And then we got together with the children to explain what we're doing there. And I think this is a great synopsis of what our Coast Guard, what your Coast Guard is doing in the Arctic right now. And that is letting the people know that we intend to be here because we feel like we have a duty to be here, why we're here, what we're doing, and to listen to their perspective because as was said by our last speaker, there's a lot more to learn by being there and listening to the folks that live there for thousands of years than there is by reading in a book or watching a video. And we get that. We always make it a point to reach out to the children, too. Just some children are harder to get to. And this group of children, obviously enamored by the helicopter, but my point is that whenever we go to a village, whenever we go to any place in the Arctic, whether it's an air crew, whether it's a ship, whether it's myself going up there, flying up there commercially, we have community relations events because we understand how important that is. It is the people of the Arctic, as was said many times today, who are vested in this. And so that's really our goal is to make it a point to understand their perspective. Now, we have duties and responsibilities that we are following the laws of the land, obviously, the federal laws. And so that's why we're here for. That's who foots the bill for your Coast Guard. But getting with the people of the Arctic is not just a good idea, it's the right thing, and it's really about respect. And so That's what we emphasize with every man and woman in the Coast Guard that comes up north, that it is about respect. And as you know, respect works both ways. Now, this is an interesting group of Americans and Alaskans that are up off of Nome operating. And trust me, there's a little bit of culture shock to the feds showing up to check your life jacket. But that's just what we do. And we have to. You know, this is part of our duty. So we are regulators. And as I said in the beginning, the regulations count here just like they do in South Florida or in Southern California. Now, we have to be mindful that this is these folks' way of making a living and feeding their families, and we are. But when we come, we bring the whole package. You know, we're not just the good guys. We're kind of the tough guys, too, sometimes. And people need to understand that when we come to town. Likewise, there are 450 marine facilities in the state of Alaska. And if whether it's ashore or whether it's out in the ocean, if it has to do with the ocean, we're going to be inspecting and regulating. And so these men and women, these are from Sector Anchorage. They're out visiting a facility, and that's what we do. And so we wear the white hat and the tough hat for those folks too. We like to say that we want to be as smart as we should be about the business that's going on in Alaska. We need to be smart about it. We need to be smart about the business aspects because we want to be fair and well-informed regulators. And so that's what we try to go about doing. And the only way you do it is to get out there and understand what's going on and be prepared before you get there. You guys, we talked about the HEALY's voyage to Nome earlier today, and it goes without saying that you cannot operate in the Arctic or in the polar regions. And I'll kind of talk a little bit about that because we look at both poles as being as important. Both of them are in my area of responsibility. And the good thing is the same capability works in one as in the other. And so while this was a historic mission in Nome in 2012, it really shouldn't surprise anybody, right? I mean, if you're going to operate up here, and if you're going to resupply, and if you're going to do these things, and in terms of living in this region, you got to have the ability to move around up here. And one of the inherent capabilities required to move around in the polar regions is one of those big red ships like that. Well, you don't have to paint them red. They're easier to find if they're red, but you got to have a ship like that. That's how you operate in this region. And we'll talk about it a little bit more in a minute, but we just kind of have to bring that on board. And I realize this is the quintessential preaching to the choir here in terms of the icebreakers, but I don't think a lot of folks understand that haven't lived and worked in this region. You can't operate without them. And as I said, I mean, these assets are not just for Nome or not just for Barrow. And we work with other folks. As was said earlier, international boundaries drop down when it gets to minimum resources. This was the Canadian icebreaker up doing some mapping of the continental shelf. And the two pictures on the west side are actually, those are in Antarctica. And that's the Polar Star, and that lower picture is dated because that's Polar Star and sea sailing together. And right now, as we speak today, the Coast Guard cutter Polar Star is in McMurdo Station in Antarctica, breaking it out. They get one chance a year to break out McMurdo. One chance a year to bring fuel, one chance a year to bring groceries. And that's what they're doing right now. Well, they don't bring them. They break out the channels so the military sea lift can. My point is you got to be able to break ice to operate here. And we continue to do that, and we'll talk about that some more in a minute. On a more strategic level, we in the Coast Guard also, we're on board with the commissions and with the policy work, that hard policy work that has to be done. And I really love this because this is we've stood up, as we often do at the Coast Guard, we kind of just do it on our own initiative. We stood up this Center for Arctic Policy Study at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. Now, this is not a big event here. This is a small, focused policy center, think tank, where we've got adjunct professors, and we are looking at Arctic policy issues specifically with how they lash up to the Coast Guard. So we've got policies that, as we've heard about today, and that deal with the indigenous people of the region, the fisheries, and all these other. How does this affect the Coast Guard? And that's what these folks do for us. But my really favorite part of this is, see that kid in the upper left corner? That's a first-class cadet from the Coast Guard Academy aboard HEALY. I don't know if that was last summer or summer before, last summer. And he is the next generation of coasties. And he is getting indoctrinated at about 20 years of age here, what it's like to operate in the Arctic. and what it means to be up there, how hard it is to get there, what it takes to do this. So this is really kind of the beauty of having this at the Coast Guard Academy, is getting the next generation of Coasties to understand how important it is to operate and serve up here. We also understand that you need senior leaders to be involved in this. We have a tremendous amount of admiration for our Coast Guard men and women like the folks from HEALY that are here. But at the end of the day, you got to have a senior person to be able to get in some of the rooms and get in some of the meetings and talk with authority. And that's what Dan Abel does for us. And so I want you to know that he is your Coast Guard operational commander in Alaska. And we are served well by him. Now, this particular picture was, as he said earlier, maybe you called, there was a tragedy in the northern part of the Bering Sea early December where a South Korean fishing vessel rolled. I mean, in a minute they rolled. And approximately 60 souls lost at sea. And so here's Dan talking to the Koreans and explaining to them our search efforts. May not have a lot to do with but it's part of operating in this area. The difference between being alive and not being alive in this area of the world is this quick. And so Dan is our point person on this mission and all the other missions we do here. And so while I'm glad to come here all the way from California and hang out with y'all, I'm going back to California. Dan's going back to Juneau. And he doesn't spend much time in Juneau, though. He gets around. We understand as a Coast Guard that we are not, the status quo, the way we did things yesterday is not necessarily the best way to do things tomorrow. A lot of these experiments were done in coordination during that short window of the summer when we have a chance to operate in the Arctic with the HEALY. So just a random sampling, you know, the boats that work in the Gulf of Mexico don't necessarily work off of Barrel because it is not wide open and clear there. And there's always a mixture of ice and water. So we work on that. The tools and methods you use to skim for oil that you use off of Mississippi or off Alabama may not work off of Barrel or off of Nome. And so we are constantly learning and pressing and working, and we work with other government agencies. We work with universities, with the Department of Homeland Security, Sciences, Technology, to understand new ways to operate and to protect and do our duties up here. And as was mentioned, that's a pretty cool little thing down on the right there, lower right, the Scan Eagle. That's just, it's a pretty standard technology UAV. But using it to track oil in the Arctic is kind of a new way of doing things. And thanks to HEALY for hosting that operation. In addition to new capabilities, Admiral Abel alluded to this. You know, the Bering Strait is 44 nautical miles across there. And as he said, and as you all know, you know, 100% increase in vessel traffic. We got about 200 vessels operating through there, about 400 round trips, and expected to grow another 100% within 5 years. You know, we'll be up to several hundred. And so the potential, as anybody should know, the potential for those to get close to each other when you're navigating around the same ice flows, you're dealing with the same weather. This traffic separation scheme, this governance piece that we are investing on, this is a good thing to do. And it's not mandatory at this phase, and you know, my classmate and lawyer friend Brian Schroeder could get into much more detail than I, but it's going to be a good idea. And I wouldn't want to be at the end of the table when the insurance agent says, now, why didn't you do what the Coast Guard said? So that's what we're trying to get started here, and I think it's a great idea. Looking forward, the challenges that we have today are the exact same challenges that hell-roaring Mike Healy had. I'm sorry to keep saying that, but I kind of like that name. That hell-roaring Mike Healy had in the late 1800s, and that is, it's a long ways up here. It is a long distance. The circles that you see are basically the range rings for our helicopters that we put up on the north slope in the summertime. And you can see kind of how far they can go if they need to go and come back safely. The distance that you see down there, pretty straightforward. From Dutch up to Chutki is, 1,100 miles at best. And then you get the distance. Our closest Coast Guard facility to the North Slope is Air Station Kodiak. Well, Anchorage is closer, but I mean our operating facility there is Air Station Kodiak, which is almost 900 nautical miles from up there. The point is the distances are great. The weather is still just as bad as it was 200 years ago. But what I think is different now and what we need to take on board in the American public, the expectations are different now. That rescue mission I alluded to in the beginning of my talk, that took almost a year to complete. Literally, From the time they got the word to sail from Seattle, and they got up there and they got the reindeer and they did all these things, about a year round trip. I don't think we get a year anymore. I think we get days. As soon as one of these folks up there is with their cool gizmo iPad sat phone thing is beaming. I mean, you understand, there's a sense of urgency here. And so that's a challenge now, as it always has been. And I'll tell you, as was mentioned earlier, from a Coast Guard perspective, I mean, we are literally renters or leasers of anything north of Anchorage or Kodiak. You know, we're temporary folks there, and that's the way we've been. And I think that was great for the first 4 or 5 years operating up here. We've got to make some decisions as a nation as to what we're going to have to operate up there. A couple of pictures here. The bottom picture is the hangar at Barrow that we released last year. The top picture is the Coast Guard cutter HEALY in the shipyards. There has not been a substantial inject to the Coast Guard budget over the Arctic. I mean, that's just public record. It's been, what we've done is we've understood the resources we've had. We've taken risk in some places to cover the Arctic, and that's the way we've been operating for about 10 years, you know, literally. We are one deep in icebreakers. When I say that, I must explain. Right now, HEALY's in a long, 4-month maintenance availability period, and that's where they've got to be. They're doing this maintenance availability period. While they're in maintenance, Polar Star's in the South Pole. When HEALY gets underway this summer, Polar Star's coming home in April, they're going in the dry dock. You kind of get the picture? We're one deep here, and it's sufficient for our nation's needs for about the next 10 years is what we've talked about, 7 to 10. But we sure don't want a hiccup. I'll tell you, we sure don't want a hiccup. It's not comfortable being one deep in any of this. So I mean, that's the facts. It's not an opinion, that's the facts. The bottom thing there is, you know, those same helicopters, those are H-60 helicopters. Those are the same helicopters that we like to put at Cold Bay to cover the crab fleet in the Bering Sea. Same helicopters. Those are the same helicopters I put in San Diego to chase bad guys bringing Dougs into our country. And so we didn't get a new inject to H-60 helicopters either when the Coast Guard started opening up. So this is just facts. And we move them around, and we like to consider ourselves pretty adaptable and agile, and we show that. And this hangar here in Barrow, we leased that last summer. I don't think it's available this summer. So that's the facts of business. So adaptable, agile, but we have to deal with the circumstances we've got. And at the risk of being the master of the obvious, folks are coming, right? I mean, we've had 10 years worth of 200 passenger cruise vessels, 10 years worth, more or less, 150, 200 packs. This is 1,000 passengers. I will give our Canadian brothers a lot of credit. Because they're going across Alaska to Canada, they've got to comply with Canadian regulations, which are much more advanced when it comes to requirements for these vessels. And for that, we are blessed. But this is inevitable, and there's more of this coming, I think. I mean, likewise, I mean, this is a Russian oil platform. You probably recognize that. But the Coast Guard obviously is not the issuer of permits to explore natural resources. It's really interesting for me to come here and to kind of see the controlled tension between the resource development camp and the environmental camp and looking for middle ground, and I appreciate that. And I really don't have I'm not in either camp, right? I'm the guy that before they get here, if the Congress, Senator Murkowski has written a law that says they need to do this, I got to check them. And then if something doesn't go well, we're the guys that come over the horizon to try and reconcile it. So, you know, I'm not sure what time schedule this will be on, but I'm pretty confident we're going to be facing these challenges. Likewise, this is the case that Admiral Abel talked about. This is the lone sailor aboard the Altan Girl. I got to tell you, I was on phone comms with him when this was happening. And my wife is no Arctic explorer, right? Trust me. She's from Texas, and she's no Arctic explorer. But I'm telling her about this guy, and as he described, you know, well, I was in a pool the size of a football field. Well, now it's the size of an Olympic swimming pool. And then when I told her about him beating on the pots and pans to scare the polar bears off, my wife said, that polar bear is going to figure that out pretty soon. And so you know, we decided, as Admiral Abel said, we better get out of there. And so my point is not to belabor this. The truth is, we're one deep in icebreakers. The HEALY just happened to be. I mean, you want to talk about luck for this gentleman. They were 2 days away. They could have very easily been in Dutch doing resupply. They could have been anywhere. They could have more than likely been a week away, and it would have had a different ending. And we diverted 2 days from our National Science Foundation mission to go get this guy. And trust me, the Science Foundation was not thrilled about him and our choices. I mean, they understood it, but trust me, they were not thrilled. But this is, when you're one deep, these are the choices you make, and there's more of these coming. People think the Arctic is ice-free. They watch a couple of 2020 specials on TV, and they think, oh, gosh, let's go up there. And they don't understand how dangerous it is. And that's what's going on. And so I see more of this than less. And whenever this happens, the truth is Admiral Abel is going to be getting those texts. And these are hard calls to make. Last year, when we were going to the South Pole, at the risk of, kind of going down a rabbit hole, we're going to South Pole. Polar Star was in Sydney, or en route to Sydney. You might remember there was a Russian breaker, or research vessel that was beset in the ice, and there was a Chinese vessel, called herself an icebreaker, but she didn't do so good that day. The Shui Long, she was beset in the ice. And so we literally diverted Polar Star, and thank goodness the wind shifted. They got out of there. But let me tell you, that was a national discussion because we were putting at risk the resupply of McMurdo. And that's not a trivial thing to put at risk. So anyway, you get the point. There's risk there that goes back to the beginning of time. This was alluded to. Both of the groundings, since there was one in 07 and one in 10 in the Arctic region, they were both because people thought they were in good water, and they weren't. Now, if you look at this chart, and you guys have been to sea, looks like an average chart, but if you look at it up close, there's a lot of white space there, which basically means we don't know how deep it is, or we don't have good soundings, or they're not current. And you don't have to look hard at all to look for a chart that shows soundings from the 1800s, the early 1900s of this region. That's just reality. That's where we operate. And then lastly, and I don't want to belabor this, lastly, this is you can Google this, world's icebreakers. This is kind of the relative racking and stacking of the world's icebreakers. Just the way it is. It's not an opinion, it's a fact. There may be some of this that's not quite current. Some people are building a few. Some people have taken some out of commission. But that's the point. And that's the reality that we deal with as we apportion our resources around the Coast Guard and respond here to the Arctic. But I don't want to end on a down note. I want to end on a positive note. The good thing is that your Coast Guard is doing absolutely the most that we can do with the resources you provide. And I want to tell you about one Coast Guardsman. She is the engineering officer of the Polar Star. And Lieutenant Commander Burns has got 2 small children at home. Now, I met her in the shipyards at Mare Island in California. And kind of got to know her. And she's the engineering officer on the Polar Star. This is a no-fail mission. They're in the shipyards. They got a time to get in and a time to get out, and they got to sail to the Antarctic. And I said, so Kara, I said, how you doing, you know? And they were there over the holidays, and everybody else on the crew was getting sent home. We'd send them home to go for the holidays. Not Kara. She's the engineer. As Captain Stanclik will tell you, the engineer's got a lot of work to do in the shipyard. She had been away from home before this mission for 10 months if you add the underway time, shipyard times, and all that. And I asked her, I said, how you doing? She said, I'm doing great, sir. This is an important mission. I've got work to do. We've got to get it done, and we're going to go. And they did. They sailed on time, and she's down in the Antarctic right now. And that's the kind of Coast Guard we've got. That's the men and women we've got. They're going to adapt and overcome and work with the resources you provide them. And I couldn't be prouder of them and more thankful for them. So that's my speech. I don't know, have any idea what I am on the timeline. How am I doing, Rachel? Okay. Okay, so I'll stop there, and if there's any questions.
Admiral, I'm not going to ask you a question because I have an opportunity to do that. I'm going to just rise to thank the Coast Guard. What the Coast Guard has provided our state and our country unfailingly over the decades, over the centuries, I think we often neglect and fail to appreciate exactly the role that you have played. And I think in Alaska, and perhaps here in the Pacific Northwest as well, we maybe appreciate our Coast Guard more so than in other places. But know that what you do, whether it's plucking fishermen out of the Bering Sea, whether it's doing rescues, a medevac out of King Cove, whether it is this expanded role and mission that you have in the Arctic, what the Coast Guard is doing, and you're doing more with less, and that's something that we need to be working on. Of course, you've got my commitment. But what the Coast Guard does for this country is absolutely an unsung mission. And we want to be here to sing your praise. Thank you for what you do for the people of this country day in and day out.
Admiral, thank you very much for your presentation. As a bipolar person, meaning an Arctic and an Arctic specialist, I wanted to ask you one question. When it comes to Russia and China, they have an integrated Arctic and Antarctic polar strategy. When it comes to America, there's an Arctic strategy, and then there's an Antarctic strategy, which is centered around the work of the NSF, of the National Science Foundation. So do you think that there's a possibility that America in the future, and if so, what future, could actually develop an integrated Arctic and Antarctic plan?
I guess there could be. From an operational perspective, which is where I deal with this, the common denominator is the weather, the fact that it's covered with ice. And so that's really what I look at. You know, we're doing completely different activities in Antarctica, completely different. So I think the capabilities needed to do and the regulations, the kind of the policies and all those things associated with, it's completely different from trying to decide whether we're going to fish north of the Bering Straits or not. We don't have that problem. You know, well, actually the Kiwis and the Aussies are chasing illegal fishermen down close to Antarctica right now, but it's not an American problem. But so completely different problem set, more or less. The common denominator and the thing that we try to remind people is polar regions require capability that is common. And the same, although HEALY does a marvelous job in the summer in the Arctic, there will come a time when we'll need more like Polar Star capability in the Arctic in the winter. There will be a time for that. And so we've got to have that capacity and capability. So common capability required, different mission sets, different authorities, and, you know, and policy things. From my perspective, you know, it's a real science thing there. This is and nobody lives down there, by the way, except for scientists, you know. Well, a bunch of penguins. But up here, I mean, there's a whole host of indigenous issues that just don't exist down there. So other issues. Anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's kind of how I see it.
Can I bounce on that?
Sure.
Yeah, I don't have the mic, but I'm sure anyone can hear me. You say it's not the same missions, of course, but for example, I'm not, well, Iran is basically trying to build right now a nuclear icebreaker for its future Antarctic strategy. And so basically, the security missions that we see in the north could also materialize in the south very soon, I mean, in the next 5 years. So when you're saying that there's a Polar Star, Polar Sea need in America, isn't it just a 5-year or 10-year need rather than a 15 or 20-year need as you seem to imply?
No, actually, I think I'm tracking. Well, for one thing, I'm not going to discuss any Iranian policy issue. I'm pretty sure that's not in my wheelhouse. But the capability required. No, we don't. Trust me. Remember I talked about Coast Guard Cutter Stores? She was in service for 50 years plus. The next Icebreaker we commissioned will be in service for 50 plus years. Trust me on this. That's how we do it. So anything that we build, we are building for the long haul. Some people say, well, why would you build an icebreaker when you're just going to go to Antarctica and break it out for 3 or 4 months of the year? Why would you do that? Well, it's not just that. We'll use it up off of Nome. We'll use it, you know, in lots of places. And so capability required for the long haul is not inconsistent between the two. All right. Yes, sir.
Admiral, thank you for your remarks and for your leadership. The question I want to ask you is this. About 70 years ago, Franklin Roosevelt signed an executive order that said it's the Coast Guard's job to use icebreakers to assist commerce. Now, that was probably written with the Great Lakes and the Susquehanna River on cold winters in mind. Don Young and Senator Murkowski put through the piece in the Coast Guard Authorization Act in 2010 that made that the law of the land. Now, if we in Alaska want to plan on a business of supporting shipping in the same way that we support polar aviation, which is about 50,000 jobs in our state, what role do you see the Coast Guard having in kind of helping to set up an Arctic shipping system where we say to the world, you know, be it 180 degrees west, 70 degrees north on a Wednesday, we'll take you to Iceland. Or maybe we do that together with Canada, or maybe we do it together with a number of different countries. Right now, the Russians kind of have the monopoly on that convoy-type system. I'm not sure that's great for the world. And you do have this statutory responsibility to think about it. How should we think about it?
Well, I think, so if I play your question back right, if we look at the model that they're using on the Northern Sea Route, where the Russians basically enable what Northern Sea Route traffic there is by providing icebreaker service, not free of charge, by the way, they charge, obviously. With that model, should that model be in the United States and for Alaskans? Because right now, if you talk to the Marine Exchange, you hit the nail right on the head. They do not forecast exponential growth in traffic, even if it does warm as predicted, because there's still too many variables that make it unpredictable in terms of time schedule. So should we as a nation enable this and thereby reduce the variability? I don't know, Mr. Treadwell. I'm not in the national, you know what I mean? I can tell you what it would take to do it. And as Admiral Abel talked about, we're doing an icebreaker study. What would we as a nation need using the current authorities and roles and missions of those icebreakers? I can tell you how many it takes. That would be an exponential growth in icebreaker capacity required that, to my knowledge, is not in any of our roles and missions assessment right now. Does that get at it? I don't mean to talk in circles or avoid it.
No, you're not talking circles, and actually that kind of gets around it. So let's just take, the Russians charged $300,000 to $500,000 per escort mission, right? Your icebreaker budget's about $70 million a year. At $500,000, that's if you do the math, it's not that many vessels to raise that kind of money. Now, I don't know if there's a business plan, but I guess my argument is this: is I would hope, because of this legislation, frankly, the CMTS was told to do a study, and they kicked the can on this part of the issue, that we would look at this as a business opportunity for the United States. Not just as a way to put Americans to work, but also as a way to make sure that Russia can't turn off the tap. Right? If 20% of the world's energy is to be found in the Arctic Basin, we probably ought not to give them a monopoly on shipping. Right? As much as I'm for cooperation with Russia. So I'm hopeful that in your study that you think about that we run the economics on it, that we look at public-private partnerships, and that we not just take the advice of some people say it's going to take a long time, so it's never going to happen. Okay? In that 50-year window that you're talking about, it's very likely to happen. I can introduce you to shipping companies who are working to make it happen. And I just don't think we should ignore it.
Yes, ma'am.
I just have a very quick question. Assuming the funding is locked in and you have put in your requisition, what would be the time frame between laying the keel and having an icebreaker that has gone through the sea trials and is ready for action?
There's about 3 or 4 years work that happens before the laying the keel. So rough order of magnitude, it's about a 10-year window from the time they're actually breaking ice, from the time they're doing the duty. Captain Stanclik?
Yes, sir.
About right, about 10 years. So if you said go today, and you put money in the Coast Guard's checking account, and we had the, what it took to get started to get the solicitation for bids and design and all that, it's about a 10-year process. And as Admiral Abel said, it's about $1 billion. I mean, that's big money. We get that. So. Yes, sir.
I wanted to expand on my friend from Polaris' suggestion that putting themselves together, and they're still building them today. And just the other day, they bought Arctic Helsinki shipyard, the shipyard that builds 60% of the icebreakers. They are dominating this. They are dominating it in integrated plan. You might not know this, but in February 8th, 2008, the federal government took $2.6 billion in offshore oil and gas leases from the oil industry for the Chukchi Sea. I know, I was on the stage reading those bids. Before that, they took $1 billion. How many icebreakers do we have now? We have enough icebreakers now, so you can forget about that one icebreaker that's running back and forth from one end of the earth to the other, trying to fulfill your mission. Somewhere, somebody has got to say to the highest leadership, way up there, that that is necessary in order to fulfill and satisfy the frustrations that you're hearing from one end of the room to the other. Alaska is made up of people that aren't afraid of anything, and they expect leaders to be the same way so that they can live with the resources that belong and that pertain to that great state. And that takes an integrated plan. The federal government working with everything within the federal government. Another example of where the failure goes. The gentleman behind me, his inspectors get sent to oil rigs by Shell on Shell's helicopter. Where do you want an icebreaker to be when there's an oil spill like the Deepwater Horizon in the Arctic? You want it to be in the Arctic. So the federal agencies, Coast Guard, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, need to decide an icebreaker has to be there when industry's drilling, because that's where you're going to want it when the bad thing happens. And the inspectors that go there, they can't ride on Shell's helicopter unless Shell wants to get them to the rig. They should be deployed off an icebreaker to those oil rigs. And quite frankly, that's just Shell. There are, I forgot the number, 18 or so leases. Icebreaker capability is the limiting factor for them. And last time I paid attention to it, they could only drill 4 operations at once, 4 different companies. They don't have enough icebreakers, but the Coast Guard doesn't have enough icebreakers, and that's way more important to the collective interest here. And it's going to require an integrated plan. And the whole of government approach that the Coast Guard is taking on icebreaker acquisition has to have every one of these agencies that belong on icebreakers, National Weather Service, who can enhance and validate ice forecasting from an icebreaker and lengthen the amount of time that industry operates. That's not happening. I'm going to end there, but I can go on because the list is as long as my arms.
One more question. Yes, sir.
Admiral, I just want to echo what Senator Bukowski said about working with your staff in Juneau and Anchorage. They're phenomenal folks, and they really know their job. That having been said, though, I think I heard you say that basically you get the Coast Guard you pay for. What are the chances of getting a permanent year-round Coast Guard presence north of Kodiak now?
Well, it's not in the budget right now, so it's not going to happen in the next 3 years. I can say that with certainty. It's these type of symposiums, this type of public discussion, well, you know, it's what leads to those type of things. So I don't bet on, you know, speculation, because that's what it would be right now. So anyway, it's I'll just address the public-private. You know, I really do think there's room to talk about that. I'll just give you 2 things, though, from a guy that's been around the military and the federal government. One place that's worked really well, and that is housing. We got public-private housing. I was stationed in Hawaii at one point, and the U.S. Army primarily recapitalized millions and millions of dollars worth of housing. And they did it in a public-private venture. Now, that's not a ship, and it's different, but it's a collective effort. And I'll tell you, I go to this housing and I look at it, and I see what we're putting our young Coast Guard men and women in. I'm like, man, we could have never afforded this. Not in 100 years we could have never afforded this. So that's a beautiful thing. So I don't think, I would never be one to say, no, that'll never work. Because I've seen it work in that. And I bet you 50 years ago, nobody would have thought anything about that. The flip side of this, when you talk about what's inherently governmental, I've seen this too. In a lot of parts of the country, we have, and Admiral Abel will know, and any of these coaches down here will know, we've looked at, we really do not want to compete with private industry for search and rescue. So in a lot of more populated areas of the country, your first requirement is to call CTO if you're broken down off the coast of Florida or wherever, New England or wherever. That works, kinda, right? When the weather's good and when CTO's there and when all these ducks line up, it works. But we are always on our edge like this because we never know if CTO's going to get there, you know, or if the weather turns south, we're going to go get them. So there's some of these things, and that's not for me to decide, it's for the public to decide. What's inherently governmental and what's not? We're not very good at some things not being governmental. Does that make sense? Anyway, that's Charlie Ray's thoughts on that. Governor Treadwell?
Thank you for that discussion, and I think we just have to kick off that discussion a lot. I will say something about Admiral Abel's $1 billion versus the $10 billion budget and so forth. $1 billion or two for some icebreakers, and if you go the private route, you may be able to get 3 or 4. It may sound like a lot of money, but compared to a mile of dirt in Panama, it's not very much money at all. And that's the kind of canal that this ocean offers the world.
Yes, sir. All right, well, thank you all for your attention, and appreciate it.